The political incident that changed Dr. Martin Luther King's father from a Republican voter to a Democrat. In January 1960, Senator John F. Kennedy declared his ambition to run for the Democrat Party nomination for President of the United States at the elections in November that year. It was the culmination of 20 years of work done by his father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., to make one of his sons President of the United States, and which for John was kicked into high gear after his elder brother Joe was killed in World War II in 1944. Having missed out on the vice presidential ticket in the 1956 elections for the Democrats, John F. Kennedy was clean of all the Democrat losses in 1952 and 1956 and was the strongest candidate going forward into the 1960 elections. With endorsements from Hollywood heavyweights like Frank Sinatra and from young governors like the governor of Alabama, John Malcolm Patterson, this was a strong campaign. Robert F. Kennedy, John's immediate younger brother, had been embedded into the Adlai Stevenson campaign in 1956 to learn how presidential campaigns could be run, and he was put in charge of running John's campaign in 1960. Whilst it was a strong Democrat campaign for president from Kennedy, it was also going to be going up against the vice president of the last 8 years, Richard Nixon, who had been vice president to President Eisenhower, who had won 2 landslide victories over the Democrats. And so a national check of the credentials of the Kennedy campaign had to be done, and it was discovered that they would have 2 major flaws. The first flaw for Senator John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign was that he was Irish Catholic. This was the same flaw experienced by Al Smith, the former governor of New York and the first Irish Catholic presidential candidate in United States history. The problem Americans had with a Catholic president was that they were afraid that he would have an allegiance to the Vatican. They wanted a president who believed in the separation of church and state. This problem was especially critical for the Democrats in the Deep South, which was largely Protestant, and they had done their calculations, and there was no way they could win the presidential election without winning the Deep South, which was also pro-segregation. The second critical issue faced by the Kennedy campaign was the African American vote and civil rights. As a senator representing the state of Massachusetts, where the African American vote wasn't a substantial part of a winning strategy, John F. Kennedy lacked the experience in dealing with African American issues or the contacts needed to turn out the African American vote. With the critical importance of the pro-segregationist Deep South to the campaign strategy of the Kennedy campaign, they faced a conundrum: how to effectively campaign for the African American vote and deal with civil rights issues without turning off the Deep South. The question of Senator Kennedy's alleged fealty to the Pope in Rome was quickly addressed in September during an appearance at the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, emphatically stating, "I am not a Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democrat Party's candidate for president, who also happens to be Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." A civil rights demonstration in Atlanta and its unfortunate aftermath would provide Senator Kennedy with a game-changing choice in a historically tight campaign. Sit-ins had become a nonviolent means used by African American students to protest for civil rights since February 1960, when it was first used in Greensboro, North Carolina. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was invited by student leaders to join a sit-in at Rich's department store on October 19, 1960. He was subsequently arrested along with the other protesters, but unlike the students, would not be released. He was held in custody and later sentenced to 4 months in jail on the flimsy account of having a previous driving violation in the state of Georgia. The civil rights movement and the King family had a cordial relationship with Vice President Richard Nixon, but when they approached him for help, he shunned them. Senator John F. Kennedy, after hearing about the case, called Coretta Scott King to show support and concern for the plight of her husband, whilst liaising with the governor, Ernest Vandiver, who was also a Democrat, to push for his release. At the same time, Robert F. Kennedy, who had previously worked at the Justice Department, used his contacts and knowledge of the law to put pressure on the judge to release Dr. King. Together, the pressure by the Kennedy brothers paid off, and Dr. King was released on October 26th, back to his pregnant wife and family. The details of the Kennedy involvement was kept quiet, and in return, it was the push needed for those on the fence in the African American community, a lot of whom had historically voted Republican, to vote Democrat, once word of what the Kennedys had done filtered down through the community. One of those late holdover African American Republican voters was Dr. King's father and Georgia native, Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. On November 8, 1960, John F. Kennedy would become not just the youngest president elected in U.S. history, but also the first one to win the election, despite winning less states than his opponent. His margin of victory in the popular vote was just 0.17%, the second smallest in U.S. political history. Conversely, John F. Kennedy would win 68% of the African American vote, as compared to 61% won by Adlai Stevenson II in 1956. That extra 7% of the African American vote is a major reason we would have this great speech on Inauguration Day in January 1961.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.